So what are values? Well, they're beliefs inextricably linked to our emotional needs. What do they do? Well, they do just about everything. They drive our perceptions, how we think, how we act and how we communicate. In short, they are phenomenally important to us. Now, these are the 53 values that we use in DNA. Now, we all share these values. So saying we have a value like honesty is irrelevant. We all have it. I have it, Lance Armstrong has it. What's important is how we rank our values one to the other, what our value priorities are. Now, values tend to work in groups. So, in these two groups here, what we'll find is that if a value like honesty is one of our most important values, then the values very close to it on the map will also be important to us, like being forgiving and loyalty in the case of honesty. And the values on the opposite side of the map will tend to be least important to us. So in this instance, looking at those two groups of values, the values in the top are all about cooperation. They're about looking at the big picture. Whereas the values at the bottom, they promote competitiveness and a more focused approach. Now, to see how these values affect us in real life, I want to take the example of the recent Chris Huhne, Vicky Pryce debacle. Now, in the first instance, had he been driven more by honesty and she had been more forgiving, then clearly the problem they've got themselves into wouldn't have arisen in the first instance. However, it's interesting that once they got to the situation where he had been outed as the driver of the car, he still had options. If he had decided to be driven by honesty, then he'd have put his hand up and said, "Fair enough, I did it, I'm very, very sorry." And maybe he'd have got away with a slap on the wrist. But that's not the route he chose to take. The reason for this are those values in the bottom circle. Chief amongst these is preserving public image. This means keeping up appearances. So he's thinking, if I admit that I broke the law and then I lied about it, this is going to look very, very bad for me as an MP. This is going to have an impact on the related value of ambition. So he's thinking, this could wreck my career. And this has a knock-on effect to all the values around it, including social power, influence, maybe even wealth. So with these values doing the driving, he embarked on a competitive strategy. He stepped up, went toe-to-toe with his ex-wife, and ended up with 8 months in prison. Now, this dilemma as to whether we should be competitive or cooperative, this is the stuff of the prisoner's dilemma, and much research has been done into this. And what we find from this research is that competitive strategies are the best in a one-on-one situation where it's winner takes all. Whereas if there are intertwined relationships, the type we clearly find inside companies, or there's a more long-term outcome where the parties will play out the same game again and again and again, then it's cooperative strategies that always come out on top. So how does this relate to business and to companies? Now, what I've done in this graphic is I've superimposed some corporate values over personal values. So we have a corporate value such as brand. This equates very closely to the personal value of preserving public image. And then we've got integrity, that value much beloved of V&V statements, and this maps very closely with the personal value with honesty. Now, companies would say all these values are hugely important to them, but in reality it's the values in that bottom circle that are the most important to them. Business is competitive, it's compete, or you don't survive. So consequently, businesses have a competitive value set. They're the values that dominate, so they tend to attract competitively minded people. And of course the most competitive of those will tend to rise to the top and fill boardrooms, thereby giving companies this competitive culture. Yet we know that cooperative strategies are the ones that produce the best outcome in the long term, especially when the relationships are intertwined, as they are inside a company. So this is the challenge for companies. How do you create a cooperative culture inside a competitive organisation? At some point, those two worlds have to meet. And really, you have to understand needs and values if you're to be able to do this.